Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you. My name is Alistair Chapman. I'm chairman of the Wellington Trust, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this monthly lecture, which this occasion, we're delighted to say, is also the Institute of Seamanship's annual lecture. And to that end, we thank both our speaker tonight, who is the president of the Institute of Seamanship, and also John Johnson Allen, who will be familiar to many of you, who is their chairman. As I say, welcome to you, all 112 of you so far, 113, and increasing. One or two, as usual, housekeeping notes. You will have the opportunity to put questions in two ways. First of all, during the lecture, the question and answer icon at the bottom is the one to use, and Fiona our manager, will be collecting all these questions, and Jenny, one or the other, I can't remember who, Jenny Mosley. And if you'd like to put those questions, we'll try and get through many of them, if not all of them, during the session. Just as a side point, don't use the chat icon, just the Q&A icon that is the bottom of your screen. If you want to stay on at the end of the lecture, as usual, please do. That really is the other Q&A session, but much more informal. And you will be able to go on camera, on sound, and join those happy bands of some of them very regular pilgrims who make it every month and stay around afterwards. And those are always very enjoyable occasions. And I do believe that John Lang, our honored speaker tonight, is actually very kindly staying around for that session as well. Once again, there will be a recording of this lecture, which will be available to you. The link will be sent to you, and you please share it as far and wide as you like. That completes the housekeeping notes. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is Rear Admiral John Lang DL, RN, the president of the Institute of Seamanship. John, most unusually, although he's a professional mariner, he has actually been in both services, the Merchant and the Royal Navy. First at sea in 1959 as a cadet with the P&O Shipping Company. He then transferred to the Royal Navy, where he specialized in submarines and navigation. He was in command of 2 submarines and a frigate, and his last appointment before he retired in '95 was as Deputy Chief of Defence Intelligence. Upon leaving the Navy, John spent 5 years as the UK's Chief Inspector of Maritime Accidents before he devoted himself to voluntary work in the maritime sector. He is currently president of both the Association of Sail Training Organizations, that's ASTO, and as I've said, also the Institute of Seamanship. He is a vice president of the RNLI. He is a retired Deputy Lieutenant of Hampshire, a freeman of the Honourable Company of Master Mariners, and a younger brother of Trinity House, and I'm amazed he has any time for anything. John, over to you, with pleasure.
John, thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome. And wherever any of you are, good evening. My personal welcome to this annual Institute of Seamanship lecture in aid of the Wellington Trust. And I have called it The Battle of the Atlantic, a U-Boat Perspective. My story starts on Tower Hill, just in front of Trinity House and also the Tower of London, and almost in sight of London's Thames. Many of you will instantly recognize, I'm not giving the control, can I just stop a moment?
John, just tap your screen again, John, and then you should be able to.
Right. My story starts on Tower Hill, just in front of Trinity House, and almost in sight of London's Thames. Many of you will instantly recognize the Merchant Navy War Memorial for those Merchant Navy seamen who lost their lives in both World Wars and also the Falklands and have no known grave but the sea. The panels show the names of ships and the names of those who perished. From time to time, I go and have a look and enjoy the peace and quiet myself. On one such occasion, and for no particular reason, I paused in front of one plaque in memory of a ship called the Oporto. I knew absolutely nothing about her, but wondered what had happened. I did a bit of research and discovered she was a small cargo ship of the Papiani line that had departed Liverpool for Seville in Spain on the 6th of March, 1943. To transit the Bay of Biscay, however, she was ordered to sail north towards the Clyde to join a slow escorted convoy, making for Freetown in West Africa. And once well clear of the bay, she was to detach and make her own way to Seville. Having departed the Clyde, the convoy headed out into the Atlantic before turning south to pass the west of Ireland. Initially, all went well, but on the 12th of March, the convoy was detected by a German Focke-Wulf 200 Condor aircraft on patrol to the west of the Bay of Biscay. The Condor reported the position, course, and speed of the convoy, and this was passed to the U-boat Operational Command, who in turn informed a number of U-boats who were in a position to launch an attack. Let us now look at a rough track chart to see what actually happened. At about 5 o'clock in the morning on the 13th of March, and still dark, there were 3 huge explosions in quick succession. Nobody knew quite what had happened, but the record shows that one or more U-boats had indeed successfully managed to get into a firing position and fire a number of torpedoes. And one of the victims was the Oporto. 35 members of the crew and 7 gunners lost their lives. The youngest was 16. So what actually happened? In fact, only one submarine, U-107, had carried out the attack. She was one of a class known as the Type 7 and was commanded by Captain Lieutenant Harold Gulhos. And this slide shows extracts from the official record of what she did in March 1943. The captain had somehow maneuvered his submarine in complete darkness on the surface and without being detected into a firing position with a single salvo of 4 torpedoes and hit 4 ships. By any stretch of the imagination, this was a remarkable achievement. U-107 sailed on 5 more patrols, but under a different commanding officer. She only sank 4 more ships in an entire year and was caught on the surface in April 1944 and sunk with all hands in a depth charge attack by a Sunderland flying boat shown here. She was just one of the 863 U-boats that sailed on an operational patrol during World War II, and of these, a staggering 754 were lost for a variety of reasons. And of the 39,000 men who went to sea in them, over 27,000 were killed and 5,000 were made prisoners of war. It was the highest casualty rate of any arm of any nation that took part in the entire war. Let me pause here a moment and reflect on what makes a successful submarine of any nation. She must be superbly designed, be built to a high standard, and fitted with the best possible equipment and weapons that work, and have an inspirational leader in overall command. The successful submarine will be able to have, or should have, an experienced and talented commanding officer, a well-trained and motivated ship's company, and be backed up with reliable intelligence. It is against these principles that you might wish to form your own opinions about what went right, and indeed wrong, for the Kriegsmarine's U-boat command in World War II. So who were the sailors who went to war in these tiny, claustrophobic U-boats with such appallingly low prospects for survival? What made them tick? And how come they were the only thing that frightened Churchill? In telling the story, I examine their successes and failures and say something about how they lived in the cramped, claustrophobic conditions of a U-boat on a war patrol. To answer the question, I go back in time to the end of the 19th century, when under Kaiser Wilhelm II, that's the grandson of Queen Victoria, Germany wanted, among other things, to create a navy that would rival the might of the Royal Navy and become a world power. He appointed a talented German naval officer, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, to build a navy to challenge that of Britain. Tirpitz realized that matching big ship for big ship was not necessarily the solution and saw the potential being offered by the unbelievably unsavory, smelly, and ungentlemanly thing called a submarine. As you know, the two countries found themselves involved in a bitter conflict between 1914 and 1918. And most people today think of World War I in terms of the slaughter on the Western Front. But it was the war at sea that was to have a greater impact, and it didn't take long for the effectiveness of the U-boat to make itself felt. Shortly after the outbreak of World War I, and off the Dutch coast, a submarine, U-9, found itself in a position to torpedo and sink 3 Royal Navy cruisers before breakfast one morning. 1,500 men lost their lives. This incident established the U-boat as a major weapon in the conduct of naval warfare. But there were 3 other factors that would have a profound effect on the future of maritime warfare. The first was the Battle of Jutland in 1916, which failed to produce a clear-cut victory for either side, but it prompted people on both sides to wonder whether something other than big ships was needed to win a war at sea. And the second factor was, of course, the U-boat itself. It attacked merchant ships with both gun and torpedo, and from early 1917 resorted to unrestricted warfare, whereby they gave no warning of an attack. In April 1917 alone, U-boats sank nearly 900,000 tons of shipping. One U-boat, U-35, sank 224 ships in 25 patrols. This tiny new warship was devastatingly effective and very nearly succeeded in cutting Britain off from the food and supplies she needed to survive, let alone fight and win a war. In mid-1917, the situation was critical and led to the measure that saved Britain the introduction of the convoy system. Almost everybody had argued against their introduction, but a single statistic demonstrates how effective it was. From the moment day convoys were introduced, some 16,539 ships sailed in 1,134 ocean convoys. Only 102 ships of that lot were torpedoed, and the loss rate declined to a mere 0.6%. The war ended in November 19 and was followed by the Treaty of Versailles a year later. It resulted in Germany being forced to forfeit much of its armed strength and permanently denied her the use of submarines. The Washington Naval Agreement of 1921 contained the same stipulation, but the wording left a loophole which Germany exploited. There was nothing to stop her designing and building submarines for other nations. So she set up a submarine design office in Holland and proceeded to build experimental submarines in Spain and Finland. When Hitler became the Chancellor of Exchequer Germany in 1933, he promptly repudiated the Versailles Treaty and ordered a number of submarines to be built secretly in Finland and Spain. And he also concluded a new Anglo-German treaty whereby he could not only build up to 35% of the surface navy, but 45% of its submarines. In more or less the same timescale, the British thought it had discovered the technology to counter submarines, an underwater detection device called ASDIC. So confident was the Royal Navy in the new device that it believed the concept of submarines to be obsolete. And in 1936, Germany was permitted to build U-boats to match the number of those in the Royal Navy. By the beginning of 1935, Germany had already to start and build a new class of U-boat. They were tiny to begin with, a mere 250 tons to form a small and largely independent submarine flotilla. With building underway, the officer selected to head and build up the new German U-boat flotilla was Captain Karl Dönitz, who had commanded a U-boat during World War I. He had also been a prisoner of war following the loss of his submarine in an attack in the Mediterranean just a few weeks before the war ended. And during the years of peace that followed, he went on to command both a torpedo boat and later the cruiser Emden. Clear thinking, patriotic and determined, it was an inspired appointment. And having taken over, he reflected on his expertise in the Great War and gave much thought to increasing the effectiveness of the submarine. He devoted much time to training his U-boat crews and evolving tactics. Admiral Karl Dönitz was in many ways one of the most remarkable commanders of the war. He, more than anyone, realized that the U-boat had the potential to bring Britain to its knees. To achieve this, he calculated he needed 300 U-boats, of which 100 would be operational. He told his commander-in-chief just before the war that the decisive point in warfare against England lies in attacking her merchant ship in the Atlantic. He also began to toy with the idea that the effectiveness of the U-boats could be further increased if they were to operate in company rather than singly. The concept was tried with impressive success in pre-war fleet exercises. But one thing about using the U-boat worried many in the German Navy: the alleged effectiveness of the Aztec. They concluded that the only way for a U-boat to launch a torpedo attack and stay out of trouble was to do so at long range, like 3,000 yards. Dönitz, however, thought differently and believed the claims of the Aztec were overstated. He believed the only way to carry out an effective attack was to launch it at very short range, like 600 yards. He also had no illusion that the submarine was in effect a surface torpedo boat with the ability to submerge. Its very small surface silhouette made it very difficult to see, so he advocated the tactic of pressing home attacks on the surface at night and at close range. Aztec had no capability against a surface submarine. To achieve this, the necessary skill to achieve this, he trained his U-boats crews to a very high degree. Dönitz himself went to sea in each of his boats, and through his high standards and personal charisma, he managed to instill huge pride, loyalty, and enthusiasm amongst his submarine's crews. Meanwhile, come May 1938, Hitler had told the German CNC, Abel Raeder, that although Britain remained a potential enemy, there was no prospect of conflict with her in the short term. A building program of warships, including 233 U-boats, was nonetheless approved for completion in 1943. It was still less than the number required, but at least they had time to build. So when war finally declared in September 1939, it came as a shock. Germany's navy was woefully ill-prepared and well short of 300 submarines that Dönitz had calculated were necessary to sever Britain's merchant ship lifeline. Although the U-boat flotilla was well trained, Dönitz only had 50 submarines at the outset of the war, and of these, only 22 were capable of operating in the Atlantic. Notwithstanding these small numbers, Dönitz had deployed his U-boats to their war patrol areas before it was declared, and on the 3rd of September, they were ready. Britain declared war at 11 o'clock that fateful Sunday morning, and at 13:30, the German High Command commenced hostilities against Britain. Among the U-boats already on patrol was U-30. She had sailed from her home port of Wilhelmshaven in northern Germany on the 22nd of August and was patrolling on the surface some 250 miles northwest of Northern Ireland. At about 4:30 in the afternoon of the 3rd of September, a large passenger-type vessel was detected approaching from the east, and the captain identified it as either an armed merchant cruiser or a troopship. Having watched it carefully for over 3 hours, she fired 2 torpedoes as dusk approached, and one found its target. The ship was the 13,500-ton Donaldson liner, the Athenia, on passage from Liverpool and Belfast to Montreal, with 1,418 people on board, including Americans. She was mortally wounded and sank the next day with a loss of 117 lives, of which 28 were American. U-30's commanding officer, Oberlieutenant Lemp, later said that because she was a darkened ship and steering a zigzag course, he thought she was either a troop ship or an armed merchant cruiser, and therefore a legitimate target. Lemp had, in fact, grossly exceeded his orders and had violated both the London Naval Treaty of 1913 and the prize regulations of 1936. These required submarines to stop and search any merchant ship before attacking it, and Hitler had expressly forbidden such attacks. There were 3 consequences. The Germans were furious and did their best to cover it up. The British made the assumption that Germany had resorted to a form of unrestricted submarine warfare as a matter of policy and initiated the convoy system. And Germany had committed the cardinal sin of upsetting the Americans. Although the USA remained isolationist and extremely reluctant to become involved in the conflict, the loss of American lives did not help Germany's cause. Before I proceed any further, it might be helpful for me to say something about the submarines themselves and the people who man them. First, the boats. The workhorses of the U-boat flotilla were the Type 7 and the Type 9, of which there were a number of variants. The Type 7C weighed in at about 770 tons, was some 220 feet long, had a surface speed of 17 knots and 5 knots on batteries when submerged. It could be built quickly and in great numbers and was able to dive in less than 30 seconds and reach a depth of 300 feet in about a minute. It had a range of about 9,700 miles at 10 knots. But this, of course, could be extended by another submarine or an oil tanker. Faster speeds could drastically reduce that overall range. It had 4 torpedoes forward and 1 aft and could carry up to 14. It also had a decker gun and an anti-aircraft flak gun at the after end of the conning tower. The Type 11 was larger with longer legs, but it took a very long time to build. It could carry more torpedoes, but crucially took 10 seconds longer to dive and could go, though, to 700 feet. As I said a moment ago, they were in essence torpedo boats that spent nearly all their time on the surface. They only surged in daylight if carrying out an attack, or if forced deep by an aircraft. On average, a U-boat would only spend 10% of its time dived, as both their speed and endurance while underwater was severely limited. The normal complement for a Type 7 boat was 44, of whom 44 would be commissioned officers. In the early days, they were mainly career sailors with extensive sea experience. They were fiercely loyal to their country, proud of their service, were confident in what they did, and had a fierce determination to win. And very few of them were ardent Nazis. And yet the reality was that 8 out of 10 of them would die. Life on board a U-boat was anything but comfortable. They were cramped. Every inch of space was taken up with food, stores, torpedoes, or mines. Some patrols could last up to 6 months or more, but the average was between 20 and 40 days, depending on the usage of torpedoes or fuel consumption. Fresh water was severely rationed and only used for drinking and some cooking. Nobody shaved, and there was only 1 set of heads, that's the loos, for the crew to use. There was a second one, but it was invariably used to store food. And the only clothes used were those being worn, plus 1 change of underwear and a pair of socks. U-boat life was spent in an atmosphere of high humidity, including water coming down the conning tower hatch. It caused food to rot, the skin to turn flabby, and the charts to dissolve. Crews were very susceptible to rheumatism, gout, kidney disease, and rotten teeth. And on return from patrol, they looked emaciated and strained. There was constant motion whilst running or patrolling on the surface, and many members of the crew suffered from seasickness, especially early in a patrol, and the smell would endure against that of urine and excrement. In short, living conditions on board a U-boat were the worst of any unit in the war, bar none, and that is saying something. And yet, for all its awfulness, a deep sense of comradeship, commitment, and belonging prevailed in most boats, and much depended on the ability and personality of the commanding officer. The good ones were like gold dust, and some were very good indeed. They were ambitious, resourceful, technically competent, and very, very good with their crews. I apologize to stop just a moment. I'm stopping because my computer with the text has just moved on a bit. Yes, the commanding officers, the good ones, were ambitious, resourceful, technically competent, very proud of their service, and extremely loyal to their leader, Karl Dönitz. But as in all societies, there were a number who were unpleasant or sadistic and could make life miserable for all on board. And in the early days of the war, some were, for a while, remarkably successful and exploited every possible weakness of the Royal Navy. Among the plans to defeat the Royal Navy, they adopted an offensive approach and sent out aircraft carriers to find them and sink them. The only problem was that the U-boats tended to find the carriers first, and it was only a faulty torpedo that prevented the Ark Royal from being torpedoed within the first fortnight of the war. 3 days later, U-29 did better. The carrier, HMS Courageous, obligingly altered course to land on a swordfish that was running out of fuel while on anti-submarine patrol to the southwest of Ireland, and presented a perfect target for the U-boat that was very close by, and she sank her with great loss of life. The decision was taken to withdraw fleet carriers from anti-submarine warfare. And if Britain needed any reminder that it was facing a formidable enemy, it came in one spectacular operation 6 months after the beginning of the war. In the early hours, the 14th of October, U-47, commanded by Capitan Lieutenant Prien, managed to penetrate the defences of Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands and sink the battleship Royal Oak with the loss of 833 lives. It was a brilliantly executed operation. U-47 managed to penetrate Scapa Flow through the narrowest of channels of Kirk Sound, find and sink its target, and then escape as the tide fell and with currents of 10 knots to contend with. When Churchill realized what had happened, he was furious, but conceded the raid had been a remarkable exploit of professional skill and daring. The reaction in Germany was very different. The crew of U-47 were treated as heroes, and Prien was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with Oakleys by Adolf Hitler a few days after his return. But it wasn't just operations such as that conducted by Gunther Prien that was successful. Others were beginning to sink both merchant ships and warships by the 3 means available to them: torpedoes, mines, and the gun. But it wasn't just operations such as those, it was the mines, which particularly laid by the 250-ton Type 2 U-boats, which were ideally suited to lay mines, at the entrance of British ports, and together with some mine-laying destroyers, did so off ports such as Liverpool, the Clyde, the Outer Thames Estuary, Portsmouth and Newcastle in the first few months of the war. Their activities achieved considerable success, and some 115 ships were sunk. Some 100 minefields were laid and caught some well-known warships, including the battleship HMS Nelson and the cruiser Belfast. Both were badly damaged and their repairs took time. And mine-laying was not that easy. It necessitated operating in enemy coastal waters where strong tides and currents presented huge challenges to commanding officer. It required very accurate navigation and maintenance of the trim, that's the balance of the boat, as mines were discharged. And the periscope was always in danger of being spotted by keen-eye observers either ashore or in the air. In the early stages of the war, there were huge pressures on Dönitz to focus attention on attacking the British fleet. And although there were some warships were sunk, Dönitz never altered his view that the main target would be merchant ships. With many of them still sailing independently, the U-boat exploited the shortage of escorts and lack of air cover, and by using their high surface speed to close and attack independently routed merchant ships, they enjoyed many early successes. Now, this chart shows merchant ships sinking between the 3rd of September 1939 and May 1940. You may also notice something else. Sinkings in the early months were largely focused in the southwest approaches and were relatively light. 2 reasons. The number of operational boats was still small in those first few months of the war, and reaching the open sea from their bases in Germany meant they had to work their way past hostile Great Britain. Meanwhile, the U-boats were putting into practice the tactics devised by Admiral Dönitz to escape detection by the Aztec. Using their very low silhouette and relatively high speed, they would approach a convoy at night and on the surface. As predicted, the escorts had no means of detecting one, and the first they would know of a U-boat attack was the actual attack itself. The number of merchant ships sunk and merchant seamen being killed began to rise as U-boats slowly acquired the upper hand. And among the many shortcomings was the lack of escorts, the weakness of coastal command, the inadequate weapons and equipment, and the dearth of any useful anti-submarine warfare expertise. But it wasn't entirely one-sided. Then it pays to examine some of the operational constraints and problems faced by the U-boats. I'll return to the shortage of operational boats in a moment, but there were others, such as having to use the surface so much, particularly when on passage or changing a patrol area. Let us look at this transit problem. At the outset of the war, 2 main U-boat bases were in Germany. And to reach the North Atlantic and beyond, the submarines had to either transit the English Channel or make the long passage round the north of Scotland, and typically enter the Atlantic via the Shetland Farriers Gap. The English Channel was heavily mined, and a number of transiting boats used that route and came to grief. And because so much of the surface had to be, the transit had to be done on the surface, the U-boats were always open to detection. It was also a very long way, and time in transit meant less time on patrol. Everything changed in a few remarkable months in mid-1940, when Germany occupied Denmark, Norway, and then France. Almost overnight, the transit problems changed as forward operating bases for the U-boats became available in both Norway and the Atlantic coast of France. The significance was not lost on Dönitz, and on the day following France's signing of the armistice, a trainload of torpedoes, spare gear, and personnel departed Germany for Western France to set up new operating bases. At a stroke, transit times and distances were halved, and it gave the U-boats a massive advantage. But no matter where a U-boat was based, the most feared of all the hazards was the aircraft. I'll return to this factor in a few minutes, but reaching his patrol area for a U-boat was far from easy. And having got there, the commanding officer then had to find his target, and he could call on three sources to help him: intelligence, including citing reports from other U-boats; eyesight, and to a more limited extent, hydrophones on board capable of picking up the sounds of ships' propellers and the pinging of the Aztec. First, intelligence. From well before the war, Germany's wireless surveillance system, the Bedienst, could read the British and Allied merchant ships, or BAM's code, giving invaluable information on both convoys and escorts. They could not, however, break signals giving routing instructions. Next, eyesight. U-boats relied almost exclusively on detecting their targets visually. And it wasn't easy. In good conditions, the horizons in the conning tower of a U-boat could be seen at a range of about 7 miles and no more. And it was even closer when viewed through a periscope when dived. And it is as limited as that, sometimes only a few yards. In practice, ships, and particularly smoke from the funnel, could be seen at much longer ranges, and this was often the first thing a submarine would see. In good conditions, it might detect a ship at about 20 miles, but in poor visibility or rough weather, it was far less, and in fog, the U-boat was virtually blind. It should be no surprise to realize that even when provided with good intelligence, the U-boat's ability to capitalize on it could be thwarted by its own inaccurate navigation. Even in good conditions, it was never easy. Poor visibility, overcast skies, seas constantly breaking over a conning tower, and experience all added to the complications of taking sun or star sights. We've already seen that for the first few months of war, Dönitz really had more than 10 boats on patrol, and often far less. He had already made the case for a minimum of 300 submarines and had received some support for this, but the Navy failed to get the emergency powers to put the plan into effect. And there was a reason. It was called the German High Command, Hitler and Reichsmarschall Göring. Hitler never really understood maritime matters, but the real culprit is the officer on his left, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, a former Luftwaffe pilot and supreme head of the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht. Göring had the final say on where resources were to be allocated, and U-boat construction was not one of them. He was far more interested in supporting the Luftwaffe and the army. The number of U-boats Dönitz had actually received was far less than he had argued for, and by the time the value of the U-boat was fully appreciated, it was too late, despite a huge building program. There was, meanwhile, a second problem, which was almost as crippling: the effectiveness of the U-boat arm in the early months of war, a serious defect in their torpedoes. The problem became very evident during the Norwegian campaign, when many ships survived an otherwise successful attack because the torpedoes either failed to explode or ran too deep. The defect began to have a devastating effect on U-boat morale, and urgent steps were taken to resolve the problem. They eventually succeeded. But the ongoing problem of finding the target in the huge Atlantic Ocean remained, and Dönitz sought two remedies: improving Luftwaffe reconnaissance and the adoption of his Wolfpack tactics. First, Luftwaffe cooperation. Dönitz knew from the outset that air reconnaissance would greatly aid with identifying and locating a target, but would only be forthcoming with the help of the Luftwaffe. The Navy had made a very strong case for maritime patrol aircraft and also argued that they should come under the operational control of the U-boat headquarters. Fortunately for the Allies, it was not to be. Göring made it clear from the outset that anything that flew would be under his control and vetoed the plan. The Luftwaffe did in fact allocate some aircraft to maritime patrol duties, and I've already mentioned the 4-engine Condor as being a real menace to convoys on passage to the west of the Bay of Biscay. The second tactic that Dönitz devised was the use of U-boats operating in packs, whereby a string of them would line wait in a long line about 20 miles apart across the anticipated track of a convoy. Whichever boat made first contact would report the position, composition, the direction, and speed to the U-boat headquarters, and then sit in the trail to monitor the movement of the convoy. U-boat command would then use all the intelligence available and direct the other boats to positions. In practice, a coded box system was used, whereby they would be in a position to launch an attack by night and collectively swamp the escorts. In a sentence, this technique worked. And this chart shows what happened during 1941. The U-boats called it the happy time, and each dot represents the loss of a merchant ship. But the system had one weakness. It relied on two-way communications between the headquarters ashore and the U-boat at sea. Dönitz realized the risk his U-boats ran in having their transmissions being detected by direction-finding units ashore, but assumed that by reducing the length of a signal to about 2 to 3 seconds, it would be impossible for the British Allied equipment to obtain a bearing on it before the transmission stopped. On the first count, his assumption was wrong. The Allies were able to are capable of obtaining bearings and obtain a fix within that period. The information obtained was sufficient to enable convoys to be routed away from known concentration of U-boats. Whichever boat made first contact would report the position, composition, direction, and speed to U-boat headquarters, and then sit in the trail to monitor the convoy. And this is one of the Enigma machines, which of course the British were using, and they were intercepting, and the Germans thought was inviolate. U-boat command would use all the systems they could, including the Enigma, in order to swamp the escorts. But the system had its weaknesses. Germany realized this after a while, and they inserted a fourth rotor into the Enigma machine, but even this did not actually defeat the British in obtaining the necessary intelligence. Forgive me a moment again. The three consequences of the shortcomings, particularly about the, I'm sorry, I've lost that place again. I'm sorry. Yes, because of these problems, Dönitz was no fool, and following on from two unexpected successes by the Allies against the U-boats, he expressed concern about the accuracy and the security of the Enigma machine. Notwithstanding the conclusions, Dönitz ordered his U-boats to use an improved version of that Enigma, and this was introduced on the 1st of February 1942. Now, before I look at 1942, let me turn the clock back a few months to note that early in 1941, the Allies were beginning to have some success in sinking U-boats, and this resulted in Dönitz pushing his patrol areas further west and out of reach of the aircraft. Among the U-boat losses in March that year were some of the most successful, cunning, and talented U-boat commanders of the war, such as Prynne, who we've always mentioned, Kretschmer, and Speck. It is fair to say that few who came afterwards could begin to match their ability. Their departure from the scene was a severe blow to the U-boat command. But U-boats were still seeking merchant ships in considerable numbers. And Dönitz went to great lengths to try and establish the strengths and weaknesses of his enemy. Wherever possible, he would meet U-boats returning from patrols so he could question the CEOs on their experience. He was also determined to reward success immediately by awarding decorations based on the recommendations of commanding officers. And this process ensured that there were no long bureaucratic delay in deciding who was to get awards. And it also meant that it would bypass all the normal bureaucracy. After all, a potential recipient might not survive another patrol. And then in December 1941, an event occurred that was to have a profound effect on the conduct of the war. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. On the 12th of December, Germany declared war on Germany, which meant that American targets were fair game for the U-boats. And this was, I apologize, I keep on losing the text bit here. Yes, Dönitz deployed 12 U-boats to the Western Atlantic and the Caribbean, where it was thought new targets would be found. The first attacks were made on the 13th of January. The Americans were completely unprepared and failed to take any effective measures to prevent the carnage that followed. The east coast of the States remained fully lit. Lighthouses continued to function as in peacetime. An oil tanker sailed independently, and the United States Navy failed to use any form of convoy system. And the U-boats had a field day. And this chart of sinking shows only too clearly what happened during the first 7 months of 1942. But there was one difficulty with these long-range operations: fuel consumption. Even the long-range Type 9 boats needed to be topped up at some stage, and 10 large U-boats, known as the Type 14 or milk cows, were built to carry fuel and stores to support those on operations on the far side of the Atlantic. To be successful, it was necessary for some form of communication to take place by those involved, and for the operation to be undisturbed for the 3 hours or so it took to link up, transfer fuel, and then disengage. The Allies soon found out what was happening and used intelligence and direction finding, focused much attention on destroying the supply boats, and by 1943, they had succeeded. There's no doubt that despite the problems facing the U-boats, they have been extraordinarily successful. The peak of their success lay in March 1943, but before I look at what happened then, let me touch briefly on 2 other factors that were to influence their effectiveness. I've already alluded to the fact that Hitler didn't really understand maritime matters. He was preoccupied with the fighting on the Eastern Front and in North Africa, but he couldn't but help notice the success of the U-boats in the Atlantic. He therefore decided to divert some of the U-boats to help relieve the pressures mounting on these other fronts. So a number of them were sent north to the Arctic waters of Norway to interdict convoys supplying Russia with arms to be used on Germany's Eastern Front. It wasn't just the Arctic. There was the Mediterranean as well, to help Rommel in his endeavor to reach the Suez Canal, and U-boats would help thwart the Allies supplying Malta by sea. And North Africa, to intercept and interrupt the Allied landings in North Africa during Operation Torch in November 1942. I think most people would think that any of these diversions was in a circumstance a reasonable idea, but they had one fatal flaw. They ignored the first principle of war, the objective: direct every military operation towards a clearly defined, decisive, and attainable objective. And if I'm leaving you puzzled, the German objective from about 1941 was clear: the defeat of Britain, and the only way that this could be done was to sever her sea links. And without those links, she could neither survive nor fight. And if she couldn't fight, it would be impossible for the Allies to land in or retake Europe. Hitler forgot this absolutely vital principle by removing U-boats from the Atlantic. It turned out to be one of his greatest errors of the war. Which brings me to the climax of the Battle of the Atlantic, the end of 1942 and the first 5 months of 1943. By now, Germany had more U-boats in the Atlantic at any time before. The weather was atrocious, but they still managed to work in well-worked-up wolf packs. Dönitz, who was from January 1943 also the CNC of the Navy, was fully in control of his submarines, was continuing to send both instructions to his U-boat as well as receiving daily reports for them. Most U-boats were operating south and east of Greenland and out of range of Allied aircraft. March 1943 was arguably the most successful month in the entire war for the U-boats. The focus was on attacking convoys. To achieve this, there were more U-boats on patrol than at any time previously, and some convoys were being slaughtered. But something else was happening. The number of U-boats being sunk was also creeping up. The Allies had been learning the lessons the hard way. They were now better trained, were working well together, particularly with the escorts, had better sensors and better weapons. I will only briefly mention a few of the measures the Allies were taking, but it is interesting to reflect that some of the most effective ones were actually completely unknown to the U-boats. First, the escorts. Perhaps the most vital sensor, and still underrated by most historians, was shipborne direction finding. It enabled the escorts to get a quick, accurate fix on any U-boat transmitting close by. The U-boat's reliance on two-way wireless telegraphy communications was one of its biggest weaknesses and was among the most crucial factors that led to their defeat. The second was the long-range aircraft. With its need to spend so much time on the surface, the U-boat was always vulnerable to detection and attack. Throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, improvements to maritime patrol aircraft have been steadily made, such as the introduction of short-range radar, and the lee light, which was enable the aircraft's pilot to see his target at night. Fitted under the wing, the aircraft would home in the dark and then switch that light on at the last moment to ensure an accurate attack. The one thing that really bothered the U-boat was aircraft. To suddenly see a Liberator, a Sunderland, a Catalina, or a carrier-borne aircraft such as a Swordfish diving towards them was a nightmare, and the lookouts had to be very, very good to spot them in time to dive and become invisible. A well-placed bomb or depth charge was a terrifying experience, and a number of boats fell victim to such attacks, especially when on transit to and from their bases. It is very hard for me to describe what it was like, but imagine for a moment being in a submarine with explosions going on all around, with the lights going out, the bow pointing steeply downwards, water leaks everywhere, and the depth gauge unwinding faster, crushing depth. And some survived, but many, many, many didn't. Measures were taken to provide the U-boats with the measures of detecting radar, such as something called the METOX aerial shown here, and that detected radar transmissions. Some were successful, but the aircraft's short-range radars were much more effective, and they helped to detect a lot of submarines without there ever being finding out what was happening. So I've lost the text once more. And once found by an aircraft, there was nowhere else for the U-boat to hide. By May 1943, the U-boat losses became unsustainable, and Dönitz withdrew them from the Atlantic. Now compare this chart of merchant ship losses in the Atlantic for a 3-month period to from June to September 1943, with what had been happening earlier in the year. It wasn't, of course, the end of the U-boat operations. They continued to be very successful in other areas. But the introduction also of what they called escort carriers made a huge difference in deterring any submarines from putting their heads up above water. New boats, however, did continue to be designed and built, including a number with snorkel masts. But what was coming up to the end of 1944 was, of course, the preparations for the D-Day landings. And some boats actually did go there, and they sank 3 merchant ships and 2 destroyers, so loss of 22 boats. The U-boats finally surrendered on the 7th of May, 1945, and 153 were handed over to the victors in British and Allied ports. I should have mentioned this slide earlier. It isn't actually a U-boat, it's a British submarine in the 1960s, but it just showed submarines remaining dived and having all its sensors above the water without having to surface at all. And this made a huge difference to their operational capability. The U-boats finally surrendered in 45, and 153 were handed over to the British in Allied ports. And the man who masterminded the U-boat campaign, what happened to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz? As many of you will recall, Adolf Hitler nominated him as his successor. And for 20 days at the end of the war, he was the German Chancellor. And he was indicted for war crimes at Nuremberg in 1946, found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He died on the 24th of December, 1980. He was, without a doubt, one of the most able commanders of the Second World War. And had his will prevailed in 1939, it is just possible that the outcome of the war could be very, very different. So as I draw this talk to an end, I'm very conscious I've had to leave a huge amount out. Others have focused on the difficulties, successes, and ultimately the price paid by those who have no grave by the sea, particularly in the Allies. And I haven't even touched on the subject of shipbuilding, which did so much to defeat the aims of Admiral Dönitz. Nor have I mentioned Admiral Sir Max Horton, a former submarine commanding officer who became Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches in 1943 and did so much to ensure the ultimate defeat of the U-boats. He was in many ways Dönitz's opposite number. All the men and women on the Allied side, the ship's crews, some superb commanding officers, the air crews, the specialists, and never forgetting the merchant seamen whose bravery is too often forgotten. There were many reasons for the defeat, and this slide shows a selection. Don't bother to look at it now, as I put it back at the end of the talk for you all to read it in slower time. But to me, the most extraordinary statistic to fall out of the entire battle was that of the 870 U-boats sent on missions against the enemy, 550 did not sink or even damage a target. It was left to a few who did all the damage. And this makes me wonder what lay at the heart of the early successes of the U-boat and why they didn't do quite so well after the first 2 years. And I think the answer lies in the quality, training and experience of the crews, and especially the commanding officers of those early boats. As the loss is mounted, so did that hard core of professionalism evaporate. To give you a flavor how difficult it was to find the right sort of person to command a U-boat, towards the end of the year, the youngest man to do so was aged just 20 and therefore could not have had very much experience. Nobody has ever said so, but this picture of a U-boat plunged to the seabed with all her crew speaks volumes. With every loss like this, their strength diminished. It was the loss of that expertise that really mattered. And in the end, it is why it was so important that as many U-boats were as possible be sunk, and with all on board. Right at the end of the war, Germany did introduce a new type of U-boats, the Type 21. 118 were built and were much faster and could remain underwater while conducting a war patrol. But it was all too late. Only 2 went on active service and neither saw combat. And the last word must go to the architect of Britain's victory, Winston Churchill. From the outset, he recognized the danger posed by the U-boat. And when he came to write his 4-volume book account of the war, he said, the U-boat was our worst evil. It would have been wise for the Germans to stake all upon it. I wonder what the result would have been had Hitler understood sea power. And a final thought. Had the U-boats won, would we have been listening to this lecture tonight and helping to raise funds for the Wellington Trust? It's an interesting thought. And I leave you with final the reasons why the Battle of Atlantic was lost. And I'm going to go one more to remind you what Hitler said, that the only thing that ever frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Thank you very much.
John, that was amazing. What is even more amazing is the fact there's so much more to tell. But I think you have covered it in extraordinary depth. You filled in gaps, certainly, speaking personally, my knowledge of that war, which was the most poignant aspect of war, I think, submarine warfare. As we discussed the other day in our rehearsal, very much brought back by that boat, the film Das Boot, which is, I think, one of the finest anti-war films alongside All Quiet on the Western Front. That was really excellent. Thank you very much indeed, and for your research in that. I can see there are an awful lot of questions which have come up while Jenny's just pulling these together very quickly. I've just got one. It's not so much a question, more an observation. I had the extraordinary experience of spending 2 weeks on board a boat, HMS Andrew, when I was doing my short service commission back in the early 70s. And my God, it really did give you a sense of what it must have been like with no water, no washing, no anything else. It wasn't quite as torrid as it would have been in an Untersee boat, but it was still quite hard liars, I put it that way. But the one thing that obviously was very much part of that warfare in the early 70s was the use of layers and different temperatures in water. Do you think any of this technology ever happened, or was there ever the time for the Germans or even the Allies to develop that sort of warfare where they could hide in different temperatures so that the ASDIC beam coming down would bend and miss the boat?
Yes, before I actually answer that question, there's a couple of other points you mentioned. The television series Das Boot, in my opinion, was by far and away the best way of judging what conditions were like in the submarine. All the others were basically false, but that was surprisingly accurate.
Yeah.
You also mentioned going to see the HMS Andrew. It just might be of interest to everybody listening to this talk that she was the last British submarine to actually have a 4-inch gun on its casing, and it actually fired the last gunshot by the submarine service ever. And the question about the layers of water, you're quite right. Seawater is affected by all sorts of things: temperature, salinity. It affects the passage of sound. It's been developed much more since the war, and in fact, this is one of the techniques we use for sort of both hunting with the submarine and searching for it from above. Yes, they did have an idea. For instance, the Germans operated a bit in the Baltic Sea where the temperature and salinity levels were substantially different. So they had a feel for getting it right, but measuring it, of course, was more difficult. There are techniques of doing it now. So yes, it was, but I don't think it ultimately affected much about the conduct of the Battle of the Atlantic, though sometimes a submarine would disappear, and that they were obviously making use, whether they knew it or not, of that particular capability.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much, John. I now can hand you over to Jenny, and I think so far I've seen there are about 12 questions up.
Yes,
So,
there are lots of questions.
Nobody was doing anything for the rest of the week, were they?
I will pick out as many as I think we have time for. From Malcolm Parrott, did merchant ships have any defense against U-boats apart from the convoy system and RA manned guns fitted to their ships?
Yes, did merchant ships have any form of defense? The most effective one was actually understanding the convoy system and doing what they were told. To start with, they all thought this would be absolutely impossible, certainly during the First World War. In fact, they were extraordinarily good. They did keep station. And the worst thing that could happen to them was to have an engine failure or something and drop out and be picked up by U-boat astern. They had guns usually on the transport back aft. In fact, the Oporto of the people who were killed that day when she went back down in 1943 had 7 gunners who were also killed with a seaman on board. So yes, I'm not sure it was hugely effective, but it might have done something to promote morale. But it could be useful if you were on your own. I think a 4-inch gun going off on a merchant ship would be probably terrifying all the neighbours as well. But yes, they were armed, and they had naval personnel on board to help them read the signals and things like that. So they had as much support as they could be. Before every convoy, they used to have a master's conference run by the Commodore and the escort commander, telling them what to expect. And that again was a great help.
Thank you very much. From Stephen Taylor, how close were the Germans with their new boats? Sorry, it's just flipped. 1 second. How close were the Germans with their new boats to get back into the Battle of the Atlantic in 1945?
How close were the U-boats, in particular the Type 21, to get back into the Atlantic? There was, say, 118 had been built, and 4 were actually fully operational, but it was just too late. And for the Germans' point of view, it was a great disappointment. But had they thought about this much earlier, they were a completely new type of submarine, which in fact most Allied navies first of all operated those same boats, and we developed our own ones with the class called the Porpoise and Oberon class, and they were built very much on the same sort of system. So they were just too late. I think we, the Allies, were very grateful, because it could have made life very difficult indeed, particularly in numbers.
Thank you very much. Why were the U-boats able to dive so much deeper than Royal Navy boats, at least early in the war? Were their pressure hulls thicker, or were they better built?
Why were they able to dive deeper than the British boats? Actually, some of the British boats were able to dive quite deep, particularly those in the latter part of the war. I can't remember precisely exactly what their maximum diving depth was. But yes, the German U-boats were well built, very high standards too. I will never know what depth they actually crashed at, but it must be the most terrifying movement when you saw it winding past 700 feet and still going down.
Thank you. What would it have taken to get more Bomber Command 4-engined aircraft assigned to Coastal Command? I'm thinking primarily of the Sterling, which took less resources to build than the Sunderland and was not exactly successful with Bomber Command. That question comes from Paul Nuttall.
Yes, the Atlantic, the aircraft. To start with, they did their best they could, because there were short-range aircraft, and the Sunderland and the Catalina, which only, of course, had 2 engines, were hugely instrumental. But again, they were limited on range. There was that little bit in the middle, the gap, which was 40. The aircraft which finally solved the problem was the American Liberator, which was a bomber, and that did have very long legs, and that was the one. I don't know whether the Sterling was specifically involved, but the Halifax, of course, did it in the early parts of the war. But again, the range was always the thing which defeated them, of closing the gap in the middle.
Thank you. From Anthony Hornibrook, most excellent lecture. Thank you, sir. I served on HMS Onslaught, HMS Otter, and Opossum. Fantastic boats, and some of your pictures made me feel at home. Not a question, but I thought you'd like that one.
Can I just comment? In fact, there were 1 or 2 pictures which were actually of both British A-boats and also an Oberon. And I'm interested to hear that you served in HMS Opossum. I was first lieutenant for that period. So I would totally agree with you. Fantastic boats. Thank you.
And this one's quite relevant to Wellington. From Charles Hattersley, was the development of the hedgehog tactic led by Captain Walker RN important in the final analysis?
Yes, the hedgehog tactic, and also mention of Captain Walker, who was the commanding officer of Starling, and what they call one of the escort groups. I very briefly touched on it during the talk, but you're right. The problem with the depth charge was you got an echo from the dive submarine, and you've probably seen all the films where it went bing dong, bing dong. You went over the top of it, and then you launched the depth charges over the stern, and some of them were successful, but an awful lot missed. You didn't have to miss by a lot, and you weren't going to damage the submarine. The Hedgehog had the ultimate ability of firing the mortars or little bombs, effectively, ahead of the ship. So you could actually synchronize the echo with the range of the Hedgehog itself. And there were several that went off at the same time. And that did make a difference. And that was all part of what came in, particularly in 1943.
Thank you. A message for Alistair, really, from Anthony Hornibrook again. Alistair, you are correct. The temperature of the water affects the sonar reflections. Salt and fresh water are both detection ranges. And John, I've got a huge amount of thank you for your lecture in here. And there was just one I wanted to ask if I can find it. From Vernon Stradling. What was the technological legacy that the surrendered U-boats in 1945 left for the Allies?
What was the legacy? I think undoubtedly the point I made a little bit earlier, the Type 21. I mean, that was a completely new concept. And the Allies picked up on that and developed the schnorkel mast, which is a sort of a pipe which you put up and drew in air and discharged the diesel. That was part of the German thing, and which we also developed. And in fact, all our diesel boats subsequent to the war were fitted with the schnorkel. So that was the sort of thing. But the Germans had some of the most fantastic engineering skills and things, which were quite eye-openers to the British. So I think now all the expertise into submarine design and building, a lot of it does stem from what the U-boat was able to do and what their designers and the builders achieved.
Thank you very much. And from Michael Gretton, can you explain the contradiction between Churchill apparently understanding the danger of U-boats to starve Britain and his reluctance to divert long-range aircraft from bombing Germany to maritime patrol?
A question coming from the son of one of our finest escort commanders during the war, I knew would floor me. The dichotomy between the two. I mean, Churchill had an impossible task. He was fighting in all these fronts. He was trying to keep the Allies happy, not only Americans but the Russians as well. And so why he didn't put more effort into it, obviously the arguments weren't sufficient. When Andrew Cunningham became the first Sea Lord, I think it was a change in style, because Dudley Pound had been the first Sea Lord before. I don't know whether that was part of the failure to do that. But Mike is absolutely right. It was the aircraft which really was one of the great win-win capabilities. And we should have had it closing the gap in the middle earlier. The other thing, of course, we didn't have the Americans on our side until after Pearl Harbor. And that, again, was a key event, not directly, but indirectly, towards the ultimate success of the Allies.
Thank you. And I've got a couple relating to the East Coast of the United States. From someone who's anonymous. Were you aware an Austrian US citizen built an underwater anti-subnet in Manhattan Harbor to keep out U-boats from targeting liner troop ships?
Was I aware? The answer to that question is no. I was intrigued, but I didn't know anybody. Certainly didn't fall into my research. No. But what I will say about the American East Coast, there is a cartoon available on the website, which shows an oil tanker at night steaming northwards up that East Coast, and in the background, all the lights of Miami, and the tanker was silhouetted. An absolutely sitting duck for the U-boats. And why the Americans were so slow in understanding this, I don't know.
Okay, which leads me nicely on to Hayden Cullen-Jones's question. Could you comment on the U-boat success on the East Coast of the States?
I think I probably just answered that at the moment.
Yes.
The Americans were totally unprepared for what happened. And, you know, the naval staff over in Pentagon just didn't realize, you know, how vulnerable they were. I mean, there should have been some instantaneously learning from the British and everything which they happened. But once they did pick up, and it wasn't just US naval ships, but also the US Coast Guard. And something which, again, I haven't actually mentioned at all, but equally important, that was the role of the Canadians in providing escorts as well. And clearly the relationship with Canada and US Navy on that particular aspect left a little bit to decide. I don't think it was the Canadians' fault.
Thank you very much. I'm going to draw the official questioning to an end now, and say thank you for answering so many, John. As I say, we'll make a note of all the compliments you've received and send them on to you.
Jenny, thank you very much. I do apologize for losing the text at some stages. I'm trying to use one hand was doing one thing and the right hand was doing the other. And when it became unsynchronized, I had to search for it. I apologize. But I hope that I haven't spoilt the gist of what the talk was all about.
Not at all. I think that was wonderful. Can we do the next slide, please, Fee? Okay. Before we do that, Alistair, would you like to say anything else?
No, the only thing I want to say is actually the most telling thing, well, one of the most telling things in your lecture, John, was to see how the ship losses moved from the east side of the Atlantic to the west side of the Atlantic once the Americans came into the war, and clearly demonstrating that everything was concentrated by the German high command over onto that field. It was quite extraordinary. I would just like to say thank you so much, John, for that incredible address. And what we have through your good offices is now a permanent record of and a detailed record of the U-boat war, which will be forever, hopefully, on our website for anybody to see and to share, and for people to use it as a basis of research as well. So it's more than just this evening, for which we thank you. Jenny, back to you.
Thank you. Just to make a note, please, of the next date for the lecture, Monday, the 17th of January. We will be sending you details in due course. Unfortunately, we've had a speaker drop out, so I can't tell you who that might be, but we'll find someone and send you the details.
Good. Thanks, Jenny, very much. That I believe, well, I've thanked you. I'll thank you again, but I think I thank also everybody for coming along. We have had, I believe, up to 121 people, apart from the home team, listening into this lecture. And I think that was a reflection of how interesting this topic still is so many years later. And John, your delivery, as I say, was excellent. That ends the formal part of the evening. If you would like to stay around, we're now going to switch over, and if you want to come into the informal wash up afterwards, to which hopefully, John, you can join if you're not too exhausted.
No, thank you very much. I will stop just for a few minutes, but Mrs. Lang, who's just given me a glass of whiskey, has something which I do know she wants to discuss with me.
But that's very good, and also your blood sugar will be getting low as well. So if you do want to stay on, those who are still here, please do just stay on. It'll take a few seconds while Matt, our guru on IT, will bring you in, but you will be there. And for everyone, thank you for attending, and good night.
Good night. It has been recorded. I know, but why? I'll tell you why.
Here we go. Excellent. Very good indeed. John, that was terrific. Good evening, everyone. Barbara, good to see you. Bill Allen, good evening to you. Charles, good evening to you. Who else comes on? This will be interesting to see. Wash in. Great. Where do we start? Where do we finish? Okay, well, how are we going to kick this one off?
Well, that was wonderful. I would like to say a big thank you. And I would like to say my father, who was in charge of Wellington during the war in 41, took over HMS Westcott in 42. And I met Fred Lees, who was a seaman on the boat. And I asked him if he was frightened. And, you know, he said no, because there's a camaraderie, I suppose. Is that the wrong word to use in this lecture?
No, that's right.
But he was so pleased, and I think he enjoyed working under my father's command.
That's fantastic. Can I just ask you, Charles?
Yes, sir.
Do you have records from your father of what actually happened during his time of command, which
I
are
don't-
things we're always very, very interested in knowing
Yes.
about.
There's only one event, which was, excuse me, the Langibby Castle, and you can find that on. There's a good write-up on the internet.
Yeah, sure.
And he managed to sink a U-boat there. He got 3 DSOs eventually.
Really?
The best thing he wrote was a lecture about his D-Day landings. He was a senior officer in ferry control on Sword Beach.
Good
And some of his stories are really funny. He was there for 30 days, living in a yacht.
Good heavens above.
Yeah,
That's remarkable.
it is remarkable, yes.
I should be looking up. I would not leave the screen, but I'll go and look up in Archie Munro's excellent books and see when your
Okay.
father was serving as well.
Oh, that would be interesting, yes.
Well,
We
I can
have-
do that. If you'll
yeah,
excuse me
have-
away from the screen. We are off the informal bit, so there we are.
We have a list of his commands on his napkin ring.
Does he have a? Oh, that's fascinating. Right, let's have a look. I think I even know where to go. Here we are. Chapman, you're better. Commander I.H. Bockett Pugh,
Yes,
DSO star, which means I think he gained those while serving in other ships.
yes,
DSO RN, and he was appointed on the 26th of October, 1940, and he was relieved or was succeeded by Lieutenant Commander Seagrave on the 4th of April, 1941. So he
Yes.
was in command for about 6 months.
it must have been terrifying being out in the Atlantic in such a small boat.
It certainly would have been. All you have to do is go and stand on the upper bridge now, and you'll get a sense of how it
Yes.
was on a windy day. Not at all. I think that was great. Holly.
Hi, Alistair.
How are you?
I don't know if you're able to see me or not.
No, we can't see you yet, Holly.
I think start video. No, well,
There you are. Oh, you've gone. I can't hear you either now. You've just gone on to mute. There we are.
there are better. I don't know why. Maybe you changed your website or something. I don't know what happened. I used to be able to see. You used to be able to see me.
Well, there we are, Holly. But I know what you look
Anyway,
like.
I want to
and that's-
I want to first of all, I want to wish Fiona and Jenny
Jenny.
and Alistair. I want to wish you and John and everybody a happy Christmas and a healthy and a very happy New Year. And I want to thank John for that exquisite presentation. It broadened my knowledge on U-boats and merchant marines. Only thing I know about merchant marines, John Lennon's father was a merchant marine. Now I'll have to get into this and find out what's going on. I want to tell you that it coincides very nicely with what I'm doing in the States. My late father was in World War II Army, England, France, and Belgium, 1942 to 1945. And I am in the process of trying to obtain his military records. My late mother saved all of his paperwork, his discharge papers, but he died when I was 13. And even if he lived to be older, you know, the older daddies, they didn't think they were heroes. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping to obtain his military records, although I will tell you, John was talking about the States, the military records in St. Louis, Missouri, they had a bad fire in 1973. So we'll see what happens. Also, I would like to thank you, John. I did not know there were any U-boats on the East Coast in the States. I didn't know that.
Absolutely. Yep. No,
I
John is talking to his wife at the moment.
Oh, that's
But,
all. Well,
no.
I did not know that. I did not. And there's another interesting point of discussion. What would have happened in World War II if Pearl Harbor wasn't bombed? Would the United States even bother getting into the war? So, hi, John.
Do you want me to answer that one?
Yes, please.
I think Winston Churchill, after the Americans did come into the war, said it was virtually he can relax now were going to win it. Without the American support, I don't think the outcome would be anywhere, it wouldn't have been anywhere near what happened. And I dread to think what the consequences were going to be. But having the Americans on our side with their strength, with their material, with their manpower, their equipment, their know-how, and we will face the fact that the D-Day landings, Eisenhower, subsequently your president, was the commander-in-chief. It's inestimable, the value of the American contribution. And it all started from the Japanese attack on...
I don't know if you heard that, or, you know, if you were able to hear that or not. And I apologize. I used to be able to show my face on screen. I don't know what the heck happened. I was telling Al-Star in the group, my late father was served in the U.S. Army in 1942 to 1945 as a civilian. England, France, and Belgium. And I am in the process of hopefully getting his military records. You know, he died when I was 13, so I obviously couldn't ask him any questions, and who knows if he would even talk. The older daddies didn't think they did anything heroic. So it was your presentation was rather poignant with me, because you were showing the maps of England and the northern France. And all of this is happening while my dad is over there.
There we are. Well, we'll be interested to know when you find those records, Polly.
I've got the camera off. I've got the camera off now. You'll be
There we are.
Alistair, you've got some hands raised.
I have. Okay, hold on a second. Let's see if I can find them. Oh, yes. Di Somerville Jones. Welcome back. You're on now.
Thank you very much. I have now unmuted. I hope you can hear.
Bravo Zulu.
Brilliant, isn't it? Technology. Thank you for allowing me in. It's just a light-hearted aside in many ways, in that during my time in Anchor, the Allied Naval Communications Agency, we had the German officer who had served during the Second World War in the U-boats. And he had a story for everywhere we visited, of course. But when it came to the States and we were in Norfolk, he was more than happy to recite the fact that during patrols off the American coast, they managed to survive quite happily on fresh milk, which they secured most nights by sending a small team inshore and leaving an order or stealing pints of milk. And all went well until some fool put it out in German. And then there was all hell let loose. End of silly story.
My next rendering of this talk will include that story. Thank you.
It's absolutely brilliant, isn't it? He was so unbelievable. Everywhere we went, he had a magnificent story.
The quirks of warfare.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Stephen, hello. Good evening.
Hello.
You're looking good.
Just one of the German aces who I met years ago was a bloke called Kretschmer. John will know well what Lieutenant Kretschmer did in U-99, but he eventually got into the foundering of the new West German Navy and ended up as a NATO commander, as Commodore North Sea Fleet. And he was managing a big NATO exercise that I was taking part in 1968, I think. And he stood on his box in Copenhagen at the end of the exercise. And the ship I was in, the boat I was in, we'd landed all our Bofors ammunition. And Saconian Speed had moved in and filled up the ammunition lockers with gin and Pims and what have you. And we were the only vessel out of 50 in this exercise that were on duty-free alcohol throughout the exercise. And we became a bit of a lifeline for many of the COs of the small FPVs who were taking part. And Kretschmer stood on his box and he said, if it had not been for the spiritual contribution of the Royal Navy, this exercise would not have succeeded. Because he'd heard damn well that we were running on Pims and whiskey and gin, and I've always admired him for coming up with that remark. If he carried on in that vein in the war, we'd have probably lost a few more ships too.
I've got a question, and John, it's for you. I'm afraid it's a very quick one. If you're having so much trouble, and by the way, it didn't matter because your lecture was fabulous. If you had so much trouble in double handing, how the hell did you get through the parachute?
One-handed. No, I must know. I sometimes wonder that the perisher, and for those of you who are not aware, the British run a system called the Commanding Officers Qualifying Course, which you have to get through in order to command a submarine. If you don't make it, you return to general service. And the strike rate or the pass rate is being traditionally run. About 1/3 don't make it. So I'm one of the lucky one. In fact, the reason I could use two hands at all was because I actually did the perisher. But it is a formidable course. But and I actually went on to eventually teach on it. I did that twice, which is slightly unusual. But that is a fantastic course. But I have to say, it didn't actually involve mean operating a laptop.
50% failure rate, I think, wasn't there in the perisher?
33% failure rate it was.
33%. No, it wasn't
that's
bad
still
at all.
just a time as well.
Yeah, sure.
The officers were usually first class, but you need something which they just couldn't rise to, because I have a huge respect for many of the perisher failures.
Sure.
But I've always felt very sorry that they weren't going to continue. But usually, and with my experience, everybody who didn't make it knew that that was the right decision.
Yeah, sure. Interesting. David Blake, good evening. Or is it good evening with you? I've lost count. John, David Blake here is down in Cape Town, or just outside Cape Town. Do you happen to know whether U-boats and say boats got as far as the Cape?
Absolutely certain with that. We had, and I worked for, when I emigrated, for a German who was enemy alien there, but because he had knowledge of radar, very early radar, they were watching everything that went around the, because the coast of South Africa is enormous.
Yeah.
And, I would love to think that they had the budget to be able to be doing that now.
Yeah. Indeed.
That was, I think, a lifeline that the Allies needed to know what was going on, what was going around the Cape.
Yeah.
And we developed, sorry, just to interrupt, we were involved with developing some of the long-range radar as a result of the need, that we did that.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, if I can chip in there. Yes, indeed. Some of the U-boats saw, I don't know how many, went round the Cape Indian Ocean. And that was one of the reasons for the very long patrols that some of them did.
Yeah.
And they had a problem, as David, you will know, the Gallus Current, just off the south tip of South America, is horrendous. These very, very long swells, a boat on the surface, because I've done it, is quite a challenge. And you certainly get pretty ill on board unless you're well accustomed to the sea state. Yeah. But yes, South Africa didn't. I don't know that there's any suggestion that they went to touch down in, say, Simon, something like that. I have no record of that, no knowledge. But yes, they did go that way.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, there we are. Gosh, and what a wonderful lineup of people afterwards as well. Good to see you all. I think we're probably approaching the witching hour. But if there's anybody else who wants to add anything before we go, please speak now.
Yeah, can I just say, I can last see Holly, which is nice to see her picture.
Hi, I finally figured out how to turn on, I didn't turn on the video.
Holly, can you tell John where you are? Because you won't know.
Yes, I'm in Kenosha, Wisconsin. That's in southeast Wisconsin, right on Lake Michigan, when my apartment windows face Lake Michigan at the marina. And I'm a sucker for water, so.
I like it.
I want to ask a question. Yes. I would like to ask a question. Are there a lot of U-boats that are sunken? And unfortunately, the crew is also sunken in the sea too?
Yeah, yes. I mean, a lot of U-boats went down. Their positions are known, and they're actually regarded as a war grave. And so one doesn't touch them. If I can digress for just a moment, there was one U-boat, I forget which one it was, which was became a casualty in the Dover Strait in the traffic separation scheme with the tankers going up and down. And when the modern tanker, the very deep ones, and now the container ships were beginning to add to the number of ships going through there, their draft was such that actually it would have hit the top of the damaged U-boat, or the modern tanker on the bottom. They had to move that. in order out of the shipping lane to a shallow space in between, a place called the Varn Bank, in order that there wasn't going to be another danger. And that was one of the tasks which has happened quite recently, to move a wreck to safe water before the ships could go over the top.
Yeah.
Alistair, can I pipe in there, Mike?
Yeah, Mike. Yes.
A submarine was raised from being sunk in the Skagerrak, brought to Liverpool, has been cut up into 3 pieces, and is now on the opposite side to Liverpool across the Mersey, and is available to sea. And in fact, an arboretum is going to be built around it to commemorate the Battle of the Atlantic in the next 2 or 3 years.
That's fantastic.
And if I may have a quick moment as well.
Yeah, sure.
You were asking about records at the beginning. My dad's papers, Admiral Sir Peter Gretton, one of the convoy escort commanders that John was referring to, put all his stuff into I put his stuff into the National Maritime Museum without seeing what it is. I've now found his draft of the whole, his draft history of the Battle of the Atlantic as both a participant at fairly senior level and as a historian. He cooperated with a German professor, and there are a lot of interviews with German U-boat captains recorded in the draft, which I haven't yet read because it's unreadable at the moment. But I think a lot will come out from the German side of the Battle of the Atlantic story from this book, if we can get it out of the National Maritime Museum in a readable fashion.
What a fantastic thing to bring up, Mike. You've just actually epitomized just why these wash-ups after the lectures produce such fascinating stuff. And I think that's something Jenny and Fee, we ought to note, to make a contact. I think that would be fantastic at some stage, to be able to, sorry, I used that word 3 times now, to bring it back into the ambit of the Wellington and to make it part of the story as well. But that's brilliant, Mike. Thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Can I just say that the people who are going to digitize the book are the people who run the Western Approaches Museum in Derby House in Liverpool.
Right.
And if they're successful, which I'm sure they will be, then either the book will be published or some sort of account of it will be made public. So it'll be available to everybody.
That'll be great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for that.
I think 3 more hands raised, I'm afraid now.
Oh, golly, here we go. Mike, we've got you. Let's take Roger. Roger Francis.
Yes, I can add to the Varn Bank U-boat. I was one of the pilots piloting the ships down through the Varn Bank when this U-boat was there, and it was very worrying for the captains because they used to have to point towards the Cobalt North Buoy and go up to within a half a mile of it before altering course to go back down through the Dover Straits to avoid the U-boat. And I was certainly involved with the planning towards lifting it off the bottom. It was quite incredible because they put slings under it and they moved it across to the Cobalt Bank and landed it in the water there. And they didn't disturb any part of it, which was part of the thing with the German.
And she didn't break her back at all.
No, not at all.
Thank God for that. That's fantastic.
That speaks a Trinity House deep sea pilot. Roger, very good to see you. Thank you.
Okay, John. Good to see you too.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Hayden, I think you, was it Hayden? I'm so sorry if I've got your name wrong.
No, I'm not Hayden, I'm Hayden.
Right. I'm a musician,
Welsh Hayden.
so I'll call you Hayden.
It was really just a comment for Holly. There is a complete U-boat in Chicago Museum.
Ah, Holly.
There is. Thank
Brown.
you. Thank you. I live 50 miles north of Chicago. I am originally from the Chicago suburbs. I thank you for that.
That's brilliant. Well, there's a good exchange of information.
Thank you.
David, I'm going to finish up with you, but Colin, you've got one as well. Colin Green.
Please.
Yeah,
When
go
you've
ahead.
got time. Right. You mentioned Captain Pocket-Pew earlier. He was one of the few destroyer captains who actually stopped to pick up the German U-boat sailors and crew. That was one thing he did. And that was an incredibly dangerous thing to do, risking being torpedoed itself. I did have one question for Admiral Lang, if he doesn't mind. You mentioned a tiny percentage. You've got all those dots all over the Atlantic of ships actually sunk. But I read the other day that after convoys, the percentage of ships that were sunk was tiny by the U-boats. And even before the convoys, the percentage they were talking about during the war, with those added in, was only 2% of our merchant fleet was sunk. And that seemed to me extraordinary, given all the number of ships that we knew were sunk. Have you got any idea of the actual percentages of ships that actually got sunk versus those that got through? Or is that too difficult a question? It might be.
Colin, thank you. Before I started this, I said there's 1 or 2 questions I know I didn't know the answer to. I don't know. There's no doubt about it that certainly in the early parts of 1943, a lot of ships were being sunk. And very rare was it that a convoy got all the way from its origin to a British port without having at least one ship lost. I think that did happen about 1944, but I don't know the percentage. It's really interesting for me to go do some research and see if I can find out. But there's no doubt about it. It fell off dramatically once the main U-boat opposition had been withdrawn from the Atlantic in latter part of 43.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you for that, Colin. One thing I will say before coming on to you, David, is that I watched recently a film that was made quite recently. It's on, I think it's on Amazon Prime for those who can get that sort of thing. It's called Greyhound. It's a fictional one, but based obviously upon the experience of a US Navy commander in a destroyer on the western leg of a convoy, and what was involved in submarine attacks, etc., etc. It's a very valid film, I think. I don't know, Stephen, whether you've seen it at all. I know we've spoken about it before, but it's called Greyhound, and Tom Hanks.
I have. Tom Hanks is brilliant.
He is very good indeed. I think it's worth, Mike, isn't it? Worth seeing if people can get to see it. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Because the Americans at that stage, they were convoying to about the halfway line.
That's right.
Between the states, and then we took it over from there.
There was a gap. There was a gap where they didn't have air cover, and that as well.
Yeah, which John mentioned. Yeah. But I think the people, to my mind, who got very, very unrewarded at the end were the Canadians, because in the early days, John, I'm sure you will agree that a lot of the escorts were provided by the untrained Canadians, who had only really formed a navy in a few years beforehand, and they were suddenly expanded, and they took a huge burden in the early years, in 39, 40, of escorting. John, did you do any research into the Canadian lot?
Hey, Steve, it's good to see you anyway. But the answer to your question, I touched on it in one of the answers to a previous question. I was aware I didn't actually include it in this talk. I do, in fact, I lower my voice at this stage, do a talk about the Battle of Atlantic from the Allies' point of view. And the Canadians indeed featured. And you are absolutely right. Without the Canadians, the contribution in escort, the outcome might have been different, but they were hugely helpful, useful, and if you ever go to Halifax, you can actually go and see what they've got on record now.
There are 2 vessels left, I think, in Canada. I learnt the other day as well.
Yes,
one in Toronto.
I'm just desperately trying to remember what they were called.
Haida is one of them, I think. Haida.
One of the Flower class.
Yes.
Is it Flower class?
One there.
Yeah. If it's a Flower class in Halifax. And by the way, of my dad's 8 ships in a Royal Navy escort group, 2 were commanded by Canadian officers and 1 by an Australian. So the Canadians not only had their own ships, but they had a lot of people commanding and exchanging.
Great. David, you have been an enormous. Thank you for that, Mike. John, you were just going to say quickly.
I was just say one thing. Also, and Steve had mentioned it, is that the amateurs. It was extraordinary that Canada is naturally a maritime nation, except there's on both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. The people who came in absolute, totally unsighted on the sea, and they were stunningly good almost immediately. And we paid huge tribute to what they did.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David, Blake, and you are the swan song. This is the last one.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Thank you. I didn't mean it to be that, but it's on a different tack. Although John, you did sort of refer to the predicament that Churchill had with prosecuting the war in different areas, and we just. I'm not sure what happened in the United Kingdom, but in South Africa, we totally ignored the fact that although Pearl Harbor, the 80th anniversary, was noted, the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the Renown within a couple of days of that, and the fact that I think Churchill had to just sacrifice the Far East. I would have liked it to be observed, but now we've got to wait another 10 years before we can observe the 90th anniversary.
I was in the Jaguar that changed the ensign on the Renown when we went on the Repulse.
Repulse.
Yeah, when we went past. Was it Repulse, Renown? Prince of Wales and the Repulse. That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. There we are. I think we've done it good justice. John, thank you again. And thank you everyone else for bringing in your wisdom. It's terrific. Well done, everybody. Indeed.
And well, I'll say good night to you all and thank you very much for listening. It's been
not at all. We'll see you next year for your next subject.
Former colleagues of mine amongst the audience. I have to say, Pangborn was well represented.
Bravo, Zulu. Very good. I'm going to stay.